The year is 1943. Somewhere in the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers huddle in their foxholes as darkness falls. But this is not the peaceful darkness they once knew. This is a darkness that hunts. This is a darkness that kills. Tonight, like many nights before, American forces are preparing to launch what would become one of the most psychologically devastating tactics of the Pacific War, the night raid. For Japanese soldiers, trained in the code of Bushido and accustomed to fighting with honor in daylight battles, these nocturnal assaults would become their deepest nightmare. This is the story of why Japanese soldiers feared America's night raids so deeply, and how a simple change in combat tactics would reshape the entire Pacific theater of World War II. To understand the fear, we must first understand the tradition. The Imperial Japanese Army was built on centuries of samurai warrior culture, where combat was seen as an honorable, face-to-face engagement. Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive daytime assaults, banzai charges, and close-quarters combat where the enemy could be seen and engaged directly. Night operations, when they occurred, were carefully planned set-piece attacks, WWII, with specific objectives. The concept of random, unpredictable night harassment was almost foreign to Japanese tactical thinking. Their training focused on discipline, formation, and overwhelming force applied at decisive moments. The Bushido code that influenced Japanese military thinking taught that a warrior should face his enemy with courage and honor. There was something almost sacred about seeing your opponent, knowing who you were fighting against. Darkness in traditional Japanese warfare was merely an obstacle to be overcome or a cover for strategic movement, not a weapon in itself. This cultural and tactical background would prove to be a critical vulnerability when facing an enemy who saw darkness very differently. The American approach to warfare in the Pacific evolved rapidly out of necessity. Unlike the Japanese, who had been fighting in Asia since the 1930s, American forces entered the Pacific theater with fresh perspectives and a willingness to innovate. Units like the Marine Raiders, Army Rangers, and various specialized infantry companies began developing tactics specifically designed for jungle warfare. Among these innovations, night operations quickly emerged as a force multiplier. American commanders recognized that the dense Pacific jungles, which limited visibility, even during daytime, could be turned into an advantage under the cover of darkness. The Americans brought several advantages to night fighting. First, they had superior communications equipment, portable radios that allowed small units to coordinate in darkness. Second, they had better compass training and land navigation skills, essential for moving through pitch-black jungle terrain. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they had a tactical philosophy that emphasized initiative written at the lowest levels. American sergeants and corporals were trained to make decisions independently, crucial for the chaos of night combat, where central command and control broke down. These factors combined to create a fighting force that could operate effectively when most armies would simply dig in and wait for dawn. Guadalcanal was where everything changed. In August 1942, American forces launched their first major offensive in the Pacific, landing on this obscure island in the Solomon Chain. The Japanese, confident in their military superiority, expected conventional warfare. What they got instead was something completely unexpected. As American Marines consolidated their positions around Henderson Field, they began sending out night patrols, not large assaults, but small teams of men who would slip into the darkness with one purpose: to spread terror and confusion among Japanese lines. These early night raids were relatively simple but devastatingly effective. A squad of 8 to 12 Marines would blacken their faces with burnt cork, leave behind anything that made noise, and slip into no man's land after midnight. They would crawl to within yards of Japanese positions, sometimes spending hours in absolute silence, waiting for the perfect moment. Then suddenly they would attack, grenades thrown into bunkers, automatic weapons fire raking through bivouac areas, screams and explosions shattering the night silence. Before the Japanese could organize a response, the raiders would melt back into the darkness, leaving death and chaos behind. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Japanese soldiers who might have fought bravely during daytime engagements found themselves jumping at every sound once darkness fell, unable to sleep, constantly alert for an attack that might come from any direction, or might not come at all. What makes darkness so terrifying in combat? It's not simply the inability to see, it's the complete disruption of all the senses that soldiers rely on to survive. In daylight combat, a soldier can see threats, identify targets, coordinate with comrades, and understand the battlefield. At night, especially in the dense Pacific jungles, where even moonlight barely penetrates the canopy, all of this disappears. Every sound becomes amplified. A snapping twig might be an enemy soldier stepping on it, or it might be nothing. The mind plays tricks, creating shapes and movements in the shadows. Fear feeds on imagination, and imagination runs wild in total darkness. For Japanese soldiers, this psychological warfare was compounded by several factors. First, their training had not prepared them for this type of combat. They had no doctrine for responding to random harassment raids, no established procedures for night defense that didn't involve their own offensive operations. Second, their positions were often vulnerable. Japanese forces frequently dug defensive positions, assuming they would fight during the day. These positions had fields of fire designed for daylight visibility, not for all-around night defense. Third, the uncertainty was maddening. Would tonight bring an attack? From which direction? How many Americans? These questions haunted Japanese soldiers every single night, and the stress of that constant anticipation was as damaging as the raids themselves. As the Pacific campaign progressed, American night raid tactics became increasingly sophisticated. What started as improvised harassment evolved into a refined art form. Units developed standard operating procedures for night operations. Before each raid, participants would spend hours preparing. They would tape down everything that could rattle: dog tags, canteen cups, ammunition pouches. They would remove all identification in case of capture. They would synchronize watches to the second and establish rally points. Most importantly, they would study the target area during daylight, memorizing terrain features that could be used for navigation in darkness. Movement techniques became standardized. Patrols moved in single file, each man maintaining contact with the soldier in front by holding onto his belt or pack. They used the ranger walk, a slow, deliberate step where the heel touches down first, then the toe, minimizing noise. Communication was done through touch signals passed down the line. Every 15 minutes, the patrol would stop completely and listen for 5 full minutes, allowing the jungle sounds to return to normal and revealing any pursuit. These techniques were taught, drilled, and perfected until night movement became second nature to American infantry units. The raids themselves followed patterns that maximized psychological impact. Rather than simply attacking and withdrawing, American teams would sometimes stage elaborate deceptions. They might fire from one position, move silently, and fire again from a completely different direction, making the Japanese think they were surrounded. They would throw grenades into an area, then remain hidden nearby to shoot at any Japanese soldiers who came to investigate. Some teams would even leave booby traps on withdrawal routes, causing casualties hours after the main raid ended. Each technique was designed not just to kill enemy soldiers, but to destroy their ability to rest and recover. The Japanese High Command recognized the threat posed by American night raids and attempted to develop counter-tactics. They increased sentries, established listening posts in no man's land, and created elaborate systems of tripwires connected to warning devices. Some units implemented standing watch policies where half the force remained alert throughout the night. They tried using illumination rounds and flares to expose American raiders. In some cases, they even attempted their own night raids in hopes of catching American forces off guard. However, these responses were largely ineffective for several reasons. First, the measures were reactive rather than proactive. They focused on defense and detection rather than taking the initiative. Second, many Japanese units lacked the resources to implement comprehensive night defense. Flares and illumination rounds were in short supply, and maintaining half the force on alert all night was unsustainable given the already difficult conditions. Third, and most critically, the Japanese military culture struggled to adapt to this type of warfare. Officers trained in traditional tactics found it difficult to think in terms of asymmetric, psychological warfare. The concept of winning through constant harassment rather than decisive engagement was fundamentally alien to their military philosophy. Perhaps most damaging was the Japanese command structure itself. Decision-making was highly centralized, and junior officers had little authority to adapt tactics to local conditions. When American night raids began in a sector, it often took days or weeks for the situation to be reported up the chain of command, analyzed at headquarters, new directives issued, and implemented at the unit level. By that time, the psychological damage was already done, and American tactics had already evolved to counter any new Japanese defensive measures. Technology played a crucial role in American night raid superiority. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie radio, introduced in 1943, revolutionized small unit tactics. For the first time in military history, a squad leader could communicate with his platoon commander in real time, even during night operations. This meant that raiding parties could call for artillery support if they encountered resistance, coordinate simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, or request emergency extraction if things went wrong. The Japanese, by contrast, relied primarily on wire communications or runners, neither of which were practical during fast-moving night operations. American forces also had superior navigation equipment. The lensatic compass, with its luminous markings visible in darkness, allowed accurate navigation through jungle terrain with no visibility. American soldiers were extensively trained in compass navigation and dead reckoning, skills that proved invaluable in night operations. Some specialized units even had early night vision equipment, simple infrared scopes that provided marginal improvement in visibility, but gave American forces yet another advantage in darkness. Weapons technology also favored the Americans in night fighting. The Thompson submachine gun, standard issue for many Marine and Army units, was ideal for close-range night combat. Its .45 caliber rounds had tremendous stopping power, and its high rate of fire was devastating in surprise attacks. The M1 Garand rifle, while less common in night raids, gave American forces superior firepower compared to the Japanese bolt-action rifles. Even American grenades were better suited to night operations. The Menkei 2 pineapple grenade had a reliable fuse and fragmentation pattern that made it effective when thrown into Japanese positions in darkness. To truly understand the impact of night raids, we must hear from those who conducted them. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Thompson of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion recalled one particular night on New Georgia in July 1943. We left our lines at 2200 hours, 12 men moving through jungle. So dark, you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We moved by feel, each man holding the pack of the man in front. It took us nearly 2 hours to cover 400 yards to the Japanese position we'd identified during the day. When we finally got there, we could hear them, talking in low voices, probably guards trying to stay awake. We waited for another hour, absolutely motionless, letting them relax, letting their guard drop. Then, at my signal, we hit them with everything we had. Grenades first, then automatic weapons fire, then we were gone, back into the darkness, while they were still trying to figure out what happened. Private First Class Robert Chen, an Army Ranger who participated in night raids on Bougainville, described the psychological preparation. The hardest part wasn't the actual raid, it was the hours beforehand. You'd blacken your face, check your gear 10 times, synchronize watches, go over the plan again and again, and then you'd wait for full darkness, and your mind would start playing tricks on you. You'd think about everything that could go wrong. But once you were out there in the darkness, moving toward the enemy position, a strange calm would come over you. You'd done the training hundreds of times. Your body knew what to do, even if your mind was scared. And you knew that the Japanese soldiers waiting in the darkness ahead were far more terrified than you were, because you were the hunter, and they were the prey. The Japanese perspective on these night raids reveals the true psychological toll. Corporal Yasuhiro Sato, who fought on Guadalcanal, wrote in his diary, "The Americans have made the night into a weapon. We cannot sleep. Every sound in the darkness might be death approaching." Last night they came again. We heard nothing until the grenades began exploding in Lieutenant Hamada's position. By the time we could respond, they were gone, vanished into the black jungle like demons. 5 men dead, 8 wounded, and we never fired a shot at them. The next night, nothing happened, but no one slept. We waited all night for an attack that never came. I think that was their purpose, to rob us of sleep, of sanity, of the will to fight. Private Takeshi Nakamura, stationed on New Britain, described the cumulative effect. After 3 weeks of American night raids, our company was destroyed without a major battle. We had lost perhaps 30 men killed, but more than 100 were no longer fit for duty. Some had been wounded in the raids, but most were simply broken. They could not function. They flinched at every sound. Some would freeze when darkness fell, unable to move or respond to orders. I remember one sergeant who had been a brave soldier, crying like a child when the sun began to set, begging not to be assigned to guard duty. The American bullets and grenades killed some of us, but it was the fear of the darkness that destroyed us as a fighting force. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated how night raid tactics could be adapted to amphibious operations. After the brutal daytime assault that saw Marines taking heavy casualties on the beaches, American forces used night operations to break the stalemate. Small teams of Marines would infiltrate Japanese defensive positions under cover of darkness, targeting command posts and communication centers. These raids created confusion in the Japanese command structure at critical moments, preventing coordinated counterattacks and allowing American forces to consolidate their gains. What made Tarawa particularly significant was how night operations were integrated into the overall battle plan from the beginning. Unlike earlier engagements where night raids were opportunistic additions to daytime operations, at Tarawa they were planned components of the assault. Specific units were designated as night raiders, held in reserve during daylight hours to be fresh for nocturnal operations. These units had specialized training and equipment, and they worked closely with artillery and naval gunfire support to create coordinated night attacks that were devastating to Japanese defenders who expected relative safety after sunset. By the time American forces assaulted Saipan in June 1944, night raid tactics had evolved into a comprehensive doctrine. The island's larger size and more complex terrain allowed for increasingly ambitious nocturnal operations. American forces conducted company-sized night attacks, not just squad-level raids, but operations involving 150, 200 men moving in coordinated darkness to seize key objectives. These operations required sophisticated planning and execution. Units would rehearse during daylight in terrain similar to their objectives, memorizing every feature. They would establish rally points, alternative routes, and communication protocols that didn't rely on visual signals. The Japanese response on Saipan showed the desperation caused by American night superiority. On the night of July 7, 1944, Japanese forces launched one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War, with over 3,000 soldiers attacking American positions after dark. This was not a tactical counter to American night raids, but rather a suicide attack born of desperation. Japanese commanders knew they could not win a conventional battle, and they could not withstand the nightly psychological warfare. The banzai charge was their answer, a single, massive night assault that would either break the American lines or die trying. It failed with catastrophic losses, but it demonstrated how thoroughly American night operations had disrupted Japanese tactical thinking. The return to the Philippines in October 1944 saw night raid tactics reach their peak effectiveness. The complex terrain of the islands, mountains, jungles, villages, and rice paddies provided ideal conditions for nocturnal operations. American forces, now veterans of 2 years of Pacific fighting, had perfected the art of night warfare. They combined traditional raids with innovative new tactics like ghost patrols that would shadow Japanese units for days, reporting their movements and calling in artillery strikes, all while remaining undetected. A crucial element in the Philippines was cooperation with Filipino guerrilla forces, who knew the terrain intimately. These guerrillas served as guides for American night raids, leading them through paths invisible to outsiders, pointing out Japanese positions and providing intelligence that made nocturnal operations even more effective. The combination of American tactical skill, superior equipment, and local knowledge created a night fighting capability that Japanese forces simply could not counter. Japanese commanders in the Philippines reported that their forces were becoming nocturnal refugees, hiding in deep caves during the night and only emerging during daylight hours when they felt relatively safe. The medical impact of continuous night operations was significant for both sides, but in dramatically different ways. American forces, while experiencing fatigue from nocturnal operations, had the advantage of operating on their own terms. They chose when to raid, they could rotate units, and they could rest during periods of their choosing. Japanese forces had no such luxury. Medical records from captured Japanese positions reveal epidemic levels of combat exhaustion, what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Japanese medical personnel reported soldiers with symptoms including severe insomnia, violent nightmares when sleep did occur, hypervigilance, paranoia, and in extreme cases, complete psychological breakdown. The sleep deprivation alone was a major factor in Japanese combat effectiveness decline. Human beings can survive weeks without food, but only days without sleep. Japanese soldiers subjected to nightly harassment raids would go days with only brief periods of fitful rest. This affected everything: reaction times, decision-making, morale, physical health, and ultimately the will to fight. American commanders recognized this and explicitly incorporated sleep denial into their tactical objectives. The goal wasn't always to kill large numbers of enemy soldiers, but to prevent them from ever feeling safe enough to sleep properly. Medical studies conducted after the war with former Japanese soldiers revealed the long-term impact. Many veterans reported persistent nightmares and anxiety related to darkness decades after the war ended. Psychiatrists noted that the fear of nighttime raids had created trauma responses similar to those seen in civilians who had experienced sustained terror bombing, a constant state of anticipatory anxiety where the threat could come at any moment without warning. This psychological dimension of night warfare had effects that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The lessons learned from American night raids in the Pacific had profound effects on military doctrine worldwide. After World War II, every major military force began developing comprehensive night fighting capabilities. The tactics pioneered by Marine Raiders and Army Rangers in the Pacific jungles became standard curriculum at military training schools around the world. Modern special operations forces, from Navy SEALs to British SAS to Israeli commandos, trace their doctrinal lineage directly to those early Pacific war night raids. Technology has advanced dramatically. Night vision devices, thermal imaging, GPS navigation, and laser-designated weapons have made night operations far more sophisticated than anything available in 1943. But the fundamental principles remain the same: surprise, speed, psychological impact, and the exploitation of darkness as a weapon. Modern militaries train extensively for night operations, not because they expect darkness to provide the same advantage it once did. Most advanced forces now have equivalent night fighting capabilities, but because they understand the psychological dimension of combat in darkness. The fear response to night attacks, the disorientation, the stress of anticipating an unseen threat, these are universal human reactions that remain relevant today. As we conclude this examination of why Japanese soldiers feared American night raids so deeply, we return to the fundamental truth. War is as much psychological as physical. The American forces in the Pacific discovered that darkness could be weaponized, that fear could be more debilitating than bullets, and that denying an enemy rest and peace of mind could be as effective as defeating them in pitched battle. So the Japanese military, for all its tradition, discipline, and fighting spirit, had no answer to an enemy that turned the night itself into an ally. Those dark Pacific nights where American raiders stalked through the jungle and Japanese soldiers waited in terror for an attack that might come from any direction, or might not come at all, changed warfare forever. The lessons learned in Blood and Fear over those tropical islands continue to influence how we think about combat, tactics, and the psychological dimensions of war to this very day.